We're about to start our third short talk this conference, where we'll be looking at how can we work towards a cyber-resilient health care sector. And as we all know, cyber attacks against the health care sector have increased significantly, and especially during the pandemic. These attacks have not only disrupted the delivery of healthcare, compromised sensitive healthcare-related data, but also have had an impact on patients, healthcare professionals, facilities, and organizations. So what does the current picture look like when it comes to the cybersecurity of the health sector, and how can we work towards a cyber-resilient healthcare sector? We have the pleasure to welcome to the conference Mike Fell, the Executive Director of the National Cybersecurity Operations at the UK's National Health System Digital, NHS Digital. Welcome, Mike. It's great to have you with us today. So Mike, what we want to do, so this is in conversation with Mike Fell, so we want to hear your insights and your expertise working on this issue, and try and learn more about how the UK, specifically NHS Digital, is dealing with these really very big threats. And then we will leave some time at the end of the session for your questions, so be ready and take notes of them. So Mike, I'd like to start with a kind of like big question about what makes, and maybe this is kind of just beyond just the pandemic, right? Think about the health sector more generally. What makes the health sector a target, and what does the threat landscape against the NHS specifically look like at the moment?
Yeah, so a really important question here. So I think there's two elements to this. The first of which is to say any organisation that is connected to the internet faces a threat, whether it's targeted or untargeted. And the scale of the NHS and the health sector in the UK is such that in many cases it can just be a victim of being connected to the internet. And the reasons for that are there's over 1.2 million staff in the NHS in England. And just by sheer ratios, 1.2 million people interoperating online. Even with untargeted threats, there are potential cyber consequences there. I think there's also a really important driver here before kind of looking at the threats specifically, when we look at what the drivers are. So as well as the fact that there's 1.2 million staff, the NHS has revenue of £92 billion in England every year. And that is a financial target. There are invoices being paid, contracts being signed, and when I talk a little bit more about some of the threats that many of us will be familiar with, that's another kind of area that provides opportunity that is abstracted of necessarily being targeted on account of being a health organisation. Specifically, when we look at the actual threat, the language is quite important here, so I'll say a little bit about the vulnerabilities that the threats kind of typically target from the work that we see. But the threat, I think, is best kind of viewed as a spectrum. For the reasons that I've set out there, we've got 1.2 million staff, we've got huge amounts of money. There is a simple kind of cyber-enabled fraud element to the threat. There are people that can be phished, that are often very busy, that are working in high-pressure environments, who can be targeted by phishing attacks for financial reasons with it. There's also the element of the information that these people that are operating have. So my previous role was in the Revenue and Customs Authority in the United Kingdom, where we had sensitive personal information, financial information on pretty much everybody in the United Kingdom. In my current role, there are 22 million people that use the NHS application online, and on top of that, there's many more that are users of the health system. And in my previous role, I used to think, well, that's information, financial information that you wouldn't want your next door neighbour to know when you walked out of your house. That, I think, is just even more the case in the health system. The sensitivity of the data that is held means that even without targeted threats, the consequences of loss of integrity, loss of confidentiality of that information become really critical. So The threat largely that we see within the centralised monitoring that we deliver for the NHS is financially driven, is a consequence of being kind of connected to the internet. Obviously, within that threat spectrum, we're going to be hearing from colleagues at National Cybersecurity Centre later on. Within the United Kingdom, the NCSC went on record to say there was a heightened period of threat as a result of the Russian aggression in Ukraine, and a consequence of that is a heightened threat towards the state end. But I'd really kind of close off by saying that the scale of the health sector in the UK is such that the financially driven criminal kind of cyber is the greatest activity that we consider the threat to be.
Great. Thank you very much for giving us this sort of overview. And you know, a lot of it is also applicable outside of the health sector, right? Like in terms of people connected online, the revenues that are being generated, etc. If we want to sort of think about the threat actors and how they've been evolving over time, because we've talked quite a lot during this conference about one of the biggest challenges is the constantly evolving threat landscape. So, in your view and from your expertise, how are the threats actors evolving when it comes to tackling or attacking the health sector and specifically the NHS? How they're changing their tactics, their sort of techniques, their procedures?
So, if we look back 5-6 years, the kind of totemic example here, the iconic cyber attack on the health system is WannaCry. The WannaCry ransomware was untargeted. Was the impact to the health sector was as a result of being connected to the internet. Direct cost kind of assessed to be about £92 million. Impacts that are kind of well known. That was untargeted and a kill switch was found, and as a result the consequences were kind of significant but relatively limited. If we now fast forward to what we kind of see within the health system in the UK, it's a microcosm of broader threats that we see. So we're seeing human-operated malware. So rather than kind of wormable attacks that just kind of spread, we're seeing human-operated ransomware that is either directly targeting or not. And the reason I say that is a number of ransomware as a service operators have gone on public record to say that they wouldn't target the health sectors. Now, I'll leave it to you to judge whether you would trust criminal entities like that. And there are a range of examples where, with the Irish Health Service Executive, with Conti ransomware, and with a recent ransomware attack on the health supply chain in the UK against an organisation, Advanced, that demonstrate that the health sector is not immune from this. And that human-operated element makes it kind of a more challenging adversary. Fast forward from WannaCry, we also see data exfiltration being a key kind of attribute of ransomware. Within the recent Advanced incident, it's a matter of public record that data was accessed, and as a result, people had to be told that their kind of health records had been accessed. And the double extortion techniques as well, that were certainly not a feature of ransomware historically. Double extortion being not only is there the threat of having to pay a ransom, there is then also the threat of releasing that information that's been exfiltrated to put further pressure on. And also we have seen evidence of triple extortion with a threat of releasing that information directly back to it. So that's the wider threat piece. Typically, actually, what's the bread and butter in this space? The incidents that are handled within the National Health Service are usually related to the absence of foundational cyber controls. And if I were to leave kind of one message around the most effective way that my very clever incident responders kind of would avoid the near misses we see, it would be focus on the foundations, the multi-factor authentication, two-step verification against systems. It would be patching against the critical vulnerabilities. not always popular messages. These foundations are not necessarily the shiny, expensive tools, but whatever the threats that we've spoken to here, actually raising the bar typically comes from addressing the hard-to-do foundations as opposed to kind of more advanced.
NHS is often in the news, and a question often asked to politicians, like, and the government specifically, how much do you want to invest? Like, you know, what is the future? What does the future look like, etc. But it's often discussed in the context of capacity from, obviously, like the health perspective. Rarely, really, do we talk about the cybersecurity threats that the NHS is facing. So that brings me to ask you about the level of awareness that exists about the threats that the NHS is facing. How much is there, there's awareness on this topic amongst the kind of decision makers who make decisions around, like, funding, etc.?
So I'm really pleased to be able to say, 6 months in the health sector, we typically talk about the importance of board awareness of cyber. And what I see throughout the UK health sector is that board level appreciation of what a significant risk this is, and of support for that. And that's, contextualised. Since WannaCry, there has been hundreds of millions of pounds of investment into this. So absolutely, at the top table, there is an appreciation of the risks. And the reason for that is cyber isn't the risk per se. The risk in this space is that we fail to deliver healthcare effectively, or that there is harm, clinical harm, as a result of a cyber incident. And I think that kind of narrative really is understood. Now, that isn't to say that this is an either-or. I speak with chief information officers, with board members at hospital trusts, at a range of organisations, and there are competing challenges. The UK has an elective surgical backlog of 6 million individuals that are waiting for surgery. We have significantly elevated waits for the highest level of ambulance response times. And even when we look at the hospital infrastructure, there is something I've become an unintended expert in, known as aerated concrete, which was used to manufacture and build many of our hospitals 50 to 60 years ago. And unfortunately, aerated concrete has a lifespan of 50 to 60 years. So when I'm going to speak to boards about the importance of cyber and of maintaining their IT in support, they understand that, but in many cases there is competing demands, such as the roof leaking in the hospital and the aerated concrete risk that I used to kind of do it. So yeah, the narrative is there, people understand, but it's an ongoing challenge to make sure that the right resourcing choices are made.
Thank you. And thank you for saying that, because I think it resonates with quite a lot of what has been discussed today about what do you do when you have all these competing priorities? What do you prioritize? Where do you invest? Where do you put your attention? And I think it's important to also hear that and think about that kind of brings me nicely into my second, or like my following question about how is the NHS then, within like the picture that you drew in terms of like we have all these different challenges there, how is the NHS working towards better cybersecurity resilience? And what are the partnerships that are needed? When WannaCry happened, I mean, there was some reports afterwards saying that some steps weren't taken. As you said, the kill switch helped salvage the situation. It could have been much more disastrous. So since then, what is the NHS doing in order to become more cyber resilient?
So there isn't a single answer to that. I think the only answer that can be given is a whole range of things need to be done, many of which have been done in the NHS, many of which still need to happen. So in the last 5 years, there's been investment in centralised capability. We now have visibility over 1.6 million computers across the health system to allow central monitoring and prevention of life cyber risks. That's part of the picture. We also support the system in some of the hard choices by, where it makes sense to, centrally procuring licenses such as Windows 10 and 11 to enable the system, the health providers, to just use that without having to worry about paying for it themselves. A lot of this is also about education and awareness. So we've established a network of over 2,000 cyber associates, basically champions either directly working in cyber or interested in cyber across the health system that we can use as an amplifier, as a voice, and get key messages around priorities and threats. And we also kind of deliver central capability where it makes sense to do so. For example, a product called Secure Boundary that acts as a web access firewall, a secure boundary around users of it to free kind of local organizations up to worry about other risks. But choices have been made. So as a result, for example, of the visibility and the protections that we have over the 1.6 million devices in trusts, we've stopped several ransomware incidents hitting acute trusts. Even in the kind of 6 months that I've been enrolled, we have stopped those from happening. But a consequence of that is that we haven't focused as much on the supply chain. We think there are roughly 80,000 suppliers to the NHS in England. And I say we think because actually we don't have a central list of all of those.
Sorry, how many did you say?
80,000.
Wow.
Arguably, we could have chosen 5 years ago to manage that risk. We chose to invest in the protection of hospitals, and as I say, as a result, have stopped ransomware infections that undoubtedly would have caused clinical harm. But we saw over this summer an attack on a critical supplier of the NHS in advanced healthcare. We didn't know centrally that they delivered 60% of the 111, the kind of less urgent ambulance system within within England. We simply didn't know that because we'd chosen not to get that visibility. So there is a lot more work to do. There is decades of work to do in this space. But the approach that has been taken is to be risk-based, to be proportionate, to make evidence-based decisions, and to share where we are making choices, to prioritise one thing above another. And you know, to your question there about partnership, to do this in partnership. And as somebody representing a central organisation, partnership to me is recognising what is delivered best at the centre. And we use the kind of defend as one approach to that, but also recognising where risks are local and where investment is better and risks are better managed locally. And I think that's the core of partnership. Some of that's around awareness, some of it's around understanding the wants and needs, delivering solutions centrally that people want, but also that people need, and having a very kind of feedback-based culture to learn what does work and to stop doing what doesn't work.
That's really interesting, Mike. And I think I'm just, want to go back to this, the future landscape and how, the sort of the attacks that we will be dealing with, especially with emerging technology, AI, etc., and how it will transform potentially the kind of the threat landscape that we have at the moment. And you've talked about you make decisions and choices based on some evidence that you have, etc. When you're thinking about your future strategy, can you just tell us a little bit more about how you're going to approach it, how you're going to make those decisions? And we've heard before from Chris Rampling about how the UK now is approaching, the issue of cyber as a whole of society. So also, if you can talk to us about how you're working with other, with government agencies, etc., in order to come up with a strategy that is the best strategy to mitigate these threats that are coming our way.
Absolutely. So I think this is where I'm meant to say that we'll use isomorphic encryption to tackle artificial intelligence, and we'll use machine learning to... That's not the answer at all. Two strands to this. So I think firstly, I'll go back to the point I made around foundations. We really continue to need to focus on foundations. And in the health sector, as in arguably most, it is many elements that are not security. It's joiners, movers, leavers processes so that we're only giving access to people who should have access to our data, to our systems, to our high privilege. It's the use of multi-factor authentication. It's the repeatable arguably boring task of patching and maintaining our services in support and managing the risk in that way. And exercising as well, practicing, assuming breach, practicing, you're never going to exercise something that is likely to exactly happen the way, but that muscle memory is really important, and it's things that the health sector kind of do in a daily basis, and arguably do really well, because outside of cyber, health professionals generally are quite good and well versed in dealing with uncertainty and when things are not going the way they wish. To the broader strategy, a few different kind of tenets of the strategy for cyber in healthcare in the UK. We focus on the greatest threat, and the importance of that is using an evidence base to inform the decisions that we are making, because we can't cover all of the ground today, so we need to make choices. To defend as one, we are a community, we have loads of information that can help protect each other, loads of experience, so that defend as one approach within the health system and within broader government as well. Something I've not spoken too much about so far, enough about arguably, is the people. Investing in the professionals' skills to address these challenges is really important. I'm really fortunate in having a really capable team at the centre. We need to spread that out more, and apprentices and kind of using incubators so that smaller teams can have the broader benefit of security professionalism is really important in that strategy, and something that we'll be supporting as well. Having exemplary response and recovery capabilities is a really important strand of the strategy as well. We need to defend, we need to harden our systems, but we also need to prepare for the kind of arguable inevitability of things going wrong. And then last of all is to build secure for the future, to make sure that we are not hardwiring in any of the problems that we've seen, and where there are repeatable automation, this is where the kind of buzzwords do come in, where there is the ability to use zero trust models, where there is the ability to kind of automate, we build securely for the future to make kind of things as easy for the kind of finite resources that we've got in this space to deliver successfully.
Brilliant. Great. That's a lot of, like a range of options that you are thinking about, and it's great to hear sort of how you're kind of prioritizing and what are the different areas that you're looking at. So I'd like now to turn to the floor to take a few questions. I've got around 5 minutes, a little bit less than that. Okay, can I show of hands who has a question to ask? So we've got a gentleman over there. Anyone else? Come on. I know it's been a long day. Okay, we'll start with you, sir, please.
Thanks, Joyce. Thanks, Mike. My name's Ed Small. I'm a monitoring evaluation specialist supporting the CSSF cyber portfolio. I imagine your work is never done, so I imagine you don't have sort of an indicator of when it's the cyber security defense of the NHS is finished. But I wondered what success looks like for your organization, and if you could say how you measure the improvement of the NHS's resilience to cyber threats. What are the key indicators of that?
Yeah, great question. So I think working in this space, if you're a fan of getting to the destination, you're probably going to be less happy than if you're one that enjoys the journey. It's really easy to use big numbers in this space. There are billions of events hitting firewalls. There are incidents that we can choose kind of the thresholds. The short answer is it is hard to measure success in this space because it's risk avoidance, and that typically is hard to kind of quantify, certainly in a financial way. We are building a stronger evidence base, and there are elements that I think are real key indicators in this space. So recognizing that cyber incidents in healthcare have created increased mortality, we are very clear that actually the direct consequences of cyber attacks on the health system there's vanishingly little evidence of direct harm as a result of that. to move that next step about how do we know what's good enough and how do we know when we've got there, frameworks become really critical. So the health system, the health system will shortly be publishing a cyber strategy for healthcare, aligned to the national cyber strategy for government, and as such, we'll be likely using the CAF, the Cyber Assurance Framework, which is an outcome-driven kind of framework as opposed to an output one. And the rationale for that is to recognise exactly the point you make there about this is a journey. It's going to be a continual bit, and that will allow us through the programme of investment that we make centrally and locally to identify what those key bits are. It's not going to be a single key performance indicator. It's not going to be a single maturity number or risk score. You know, I'm not going to say once we are at a rag of amber, we're done. And I'm not going to say once we're at a maturity level of 3.2, we're done. It's going to be an ongoing kind of bit built around the CAF framework to say, what proportions of things, what kind of level of comfort do we have, supported by feedback from the system about risk appetite and risk tolerance.
Great, and great to hear about the strategy, Mike, and we look forward to kind of seeing that and maybe have you here again to discuss that. I have a question online. Have lessons learned from the Irish Health Service executive ransomware attack prompted any changes in the direction of security policy and strategy within the NHS? That's from Nathan Stewart.
Yeah, so we learn from every incident, and that was my point earlier around playbooks and exercising that. You can write it down, but with every incident, we learn from the initial phase of it. With the Irish HSE incident, they have been incredibly transparent about the response, and I think the wider community has been incredibly lucky to see that transparent response that I think is informative. And that reiterates the key foundations that we've spoken to here, not only in terms of the risk and the threat, but also around the foundational but hard to do elements that can do it, and also around resilience. So yes, those lessons have been kind of identified and feed into the way that we operate. Similarly, with the supply chain attack over this summer, we're going through the lessons identified processes. I think whatever the sector is, there's always more that can be done around communications. There's always lessons around what particular vulnerability was exploited and what indicators could have identified things earlier on. And we continue to learn from those.
Brilliant. Well, we've reached the end of our time with you today, Mike. This has been really very informative, and thank you for being very transparent and sort of laying out the challenges, but also the success. Thank you very much, and please join me in thanking him for his time.